Welcome to Creepy, the best horror storyteller on YouTube.
John and Sarah were excited to celebrate their anniversary in Las Vegas. They had been planning the trip for months, and they were finally ready to let loose and have some fun. On their first night in Vegas, they went to a fancy casino and had dinner at a celebrity chef restaurant. They gambled for a while, but they didn't win much money. It didn't matter, though. They were just happy to be together and celebrating their love. The next day, they went to a pool party at one of the big resorts. They drank cocktails and sunbathed all day. In the evening, they saw a show and then went to a nightclub. They danced until the early hours of the morning. On their third night in Vegas, they decided to go on a road trip to the desert. They wanted to see some of the natural beauty of Nevada. They drove for hours, and they finally found a secluded spot where they could park their car and have a picnic. They had a wonderful time together, exploring the desert and taking pictures. But as the sun started to set, they realized that they needed to get back to their hotel. They got in their car and started driving, but then their car broke down. They were stranded in the middle of the desert, with no cell service. They tried to fix their car, but they couldn't. They were starting to get worried. Just as they were about to give up hope, they saw a light in the distance. They walked towards the light, and they found a small motel. They were relieved to have found shelter, but the motel was strange. It was old and dilapidated, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. They went inside the motel and found the owner. He was an old man with a long beard and a creepy smile. He told them that they were the only guests at the motel. John and Sarah were hesitant to stay at the motel, but they didn't have any other choice. They paid the old man and went to their room. The room was just as strange as the motel itself. It was old and dusty, and the furniture was falling apart. But they were too tired to care. They just wanted to get some sleep. They went to bed, but they couldn't sleep. They kept hearing strange noises, like voices and footsteps. They also saw shadows moving around the room. They started to feel scared. They realized that they had made a mistake staying at the motel. They needed to get out of there. But when they tried to leave, they couldn't find their car keys. They searched the room everywhere, but the keys were nowhere to be found. John and Sarah were trapped in a motel with something evil. John and Sarah were terrified. They were trapped in a strange motel with something evil. They didn't know what to do. They decided to try to stay together and survive the night. They barricaded the door to their room with furniture and hid under the bed. They could hear the thing moving around outside the room. It was scratching at the door and trying to get in. John and Sarah were too scared to move. They just lay there under the bed, listening to the thing trying to get in. It felt like hours passed, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, the thing stopped moving. John and Sarah waited for a while longer, just to be sure. Then, they slowly crawled out from under the bed. They peered out the window and saw that the thing was gone. They didn't know where it had gone, but they were relieved to be rid of it. They decided to try to escape from the motel. They quietly opened the door and crept out into the hallway. The hallway was dark and silent. They could hear the wind whistling outside. They walked slowly down the hallway, keeping their eyes and ears open for any sign of the thing. They finally reached the front door of the motel. They unlocked it and stepped outside. They were in the desert, but they didn't care. They were just happy to be free. They started running, not daring to look back. They ran for as long as they could. Finally, they collapsed on the ground, exhausted but relieved. They had escaped from the motel, but they knew that they would never forget the horror that they had experienced. They sat there for a while, catching their breath. Then, they stood up and started walking back to their car. They didn't know how long they had been gone, but it was probably several hours. They were tired and hungry, but they were also grateful to be alive. They finally reached their car and got in. They started the engine and drove away from the motel, never to look back. John and Sarah had survived their night of terror, but they were traumatized by the experience. They knew that they would never forget the horror that they had seen and heard in the motel. They also knew that they would never go back to Las Vegas. John and Sarah drove for hours. They didn't know where they were going, but they just wanted to get as far away from the motel as possible. They finally reached a small town and stopped at a diner. They were exhausted and hungry, so they ordered a big meal. While they were eating, they talked about what had happened at the motel. They still couldn't believe what they had experienced. "I still don't know what that thing was," Sarah said. "Me neither," John said. "But I'm glad we got out of there alive." They finished their meal and paid the bill. Then, they got back in their car and continued driving. They drove for the rest of the day and into the night. They finally reached their home early the next morning. They were exhausted, but they were also relieved to be home. They went to bed and slept for hours. When they woke up, they decided to talk to the police about what had happened at the motel. They told the police about the old man, the strange noises, and the thing that had tried to get into their room. The police were skeptical, but they agreed to investigate. They went to the motel, but they couldn't find any evidence of the thing that John and Sarah had described. The police told John and Sarah that they thought they must have imagined the whole thing. But John and Sarah knew what they had seen. They knew that they would never forget the horror that they had experienced at the motel in the desert. John and Sarah never went back to Las Vegas. They were too traumatized by their experience. But they never forgot the night that they spent at the motel. They knew that they had been lucky to escape alive.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more similar horror stories.